At 3 years old, Buster Keaton's father sewed a suitcase handle onto his jacket to physically throw the toddler across the vaudeville stage. Marketed as a human mop, the preschooler was violently hurled into wooden scenery every night to generate ticket sales. To survive, he mastered fall breaking, but to keep the audience laughing, his parents strictly forbade him from crying or smiling. This extreme emotional suppression created his legendary stone face, but hardwired the child for a lifetime of severe depression and institutionalization. This is the unvarnished reality of early Hollywood child exploitation. Place two opposing images side by side. A battered 3-year-old boy treated as a disposable object, his small body utilized to scrub filthy floorboards, and a cinematic titan universally hailed as a genius of the 20th century. The modern world rightfully condemns the horrifying spectacle of a toddler being violently hurled across wooden stages, his fragile bones forced to absorb devastating kinetic impacts night after night. Yet, this same world stands in absolute awe of the glory he later received, commanding the silver screen with unparalleled physical grace and securing an immortal legacy in Hollywood history. This is Joseph Frank Keaton, universally recognized as Buster Keaton, the undisputed pioneer of physical comedy. Why is this paradox happening? And how does a child, whose very biological survival depended on burying his tears and suppressing his humanity on a brutal vaudeville stage, grow up to become the defining face of global cinema? The absolute root of this physical destruction lies buried deep within the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of the late 19th century American vaudeville circuit. The 1890s and early 1900s birthed a raw, raucous, and entirely unforgiving entertainment ecosystem where working-class crowds demanded visceral, violent thrills. Live variety shows were the absolute pulse of culture, operating in an era where child labor laws were utterly non-existent or treated as highly amusing suggestions by theater owners. It was a loud, aggressive environment where performers operated under the constant, suffocating pressure of poverty and ruthless public demand. Buster was born directly into this brutal machinery on October 4th, 1895, spending his earliest days breathing in the dust of drafty backstage corridors. His parents, Joe and Myra Keaton, were desperate performers constantly searching for the ultimate hook that would secure their financial survival in a cutthroat industry. By the time the boy reached 3 years of age, he was officially drafted into the family business, creating a newly branded act called the Three Keatons. Rather than any display of artistic acting, the events unfolding on those stages over the subsequent decade constituted a nightly, brutal exhibition of raw biological survival. The entire foundation of the Three Keatons routine was built upon the relentless, calculated physical punishment of a toddler. Joe Keaton, a physically imposing and deeply volatile man, recognized a dark, disturbing appetite within the vaudeville audiences of the era. He observed that the crowds possessed an insatiable hunger for sheer chaos, finding immense roaring amusement in witnessing a small child being tossed around the stage like a lifeless rag doll. To feed this demand, Joe initiated a practice that immediately strips away any lingering illusion of paternal care or basic human protection. He deliberately sewed a heavy-duty reinforced suitcase handle directly into the thick fabric of his son's daily performance coats. This crude modification was not a safety harness designed to catch a falling child. nor was it a theatrical embellishment intended for visual flair. It was a highly efficient mechanism of control and propulsion, transforming a living, breathing biological entity into a grip-friendly object. This handle allowed the grown man to seize his son and hurl him through the air with maximum velocity and terrifying accuracy. The air in these vaudeville houses was thick with the scent of cheap cigars, spilled beer, and the sweat of crowds seeking a momentary violent escape. The stages themselves were unforgiving platforms, constructed of hard, unpolished pine, riddled with protruding nails, deep splinters, and uneven trapdoors. Joe would violently grab the boy by the fabric strap, utilizing intense centrifugal force to launch him directly at heckling members of the audience. The small child would be hurled headfirst into the heavy painted wooden scenery or violently ejected straight into the orchestra pit. When the father grabbed the handle, the initial upward jerk placed immediate agonizing strain on the child's latissimus dorsi and trapezius muscles. The heavy fabric dug sharply into his armpits, cutting off blood circulation and causing sharp spikes of localized nerve pain before the actual throw even commenced. As Buster became airborne, the temporary loss of gravity offered no relief. Only the terrifying anticipation of the inevitable, bone-rattling collision. The stage floor did not yield. It met his small frame with absolute, uncompromising resistance, sending a devastating shock wave from his points of contact straight into his central nervous system. Every single throw generated massive kinetic shock waves that traveled straight through the toddler's developing cervical spine and fragile skeletal structure. The sheer force of being accelerated and abruptly stopped by hard surfaces threatened severe joint dislocation and catastrophic blunt force trauma every single night. If he landed on his side, the impact violently compressed his rib cage, forcing the air from his lungs in a sudden, violent gasp that he was explicitly forbidden to vocalize. If he landed on his back, the sudden deceleration whiplashed his neck, stretching the cervical ligaments to their absolute breaking point. One of their most famous and horrifyingly popular routines was grimly titled the Human Mop, a spectacle of absolute physical degradation. While Myra Keaton stood calmly to the side, maintaining a steady, upbeat rhythm on her saxophone, the violent center stage escalated drastically. Joe would firmly seize the suitcase handle, lifting Buster slightly off the ground before violently slamming him back down onto the rough floorboards. He would then physically drag the child's face, torso, and limbs across the splintered wooden stage floor to literally wipe it clean. The audience roared with laughter, entirely convinced they were witnessing a brilliant, meticulously choreographed theatrical illusion. They applauded the visual comedy while remaining entirely blind to the agonizing friction burns, the micro ruptures in capillaries, and the severe dermal abrasions hidden beneath the costume. They, seated comfortably in the dark, perceived this horrific display of physics as a highly orchestrated, perfectly safe dance of comedic timing. They laughed uproariously, entirely ignorant of the fact that they were funding the systematic, nightly destruction of a human child's skeletal integrity. Entirely deprived of nurturing in the delicate art of performance, he was brutally forced to master the desperate, unforgiving physics of falling. From the exact moment his muscles could support his own weight, the child had to calculate trajectory, mass, and velocity in a fraction of a second. The boy could not rely on padding. His costumes were thin, offering zero absorption against the sheer blunt force of the unforgiving wooden floorboards. His only armor was his own rapidly thickening fascia and a preternatural spatial awareness, born out of pure, unadulterated terror. He quickly learned how to violently tuck his chin to his chest, midair, to prevent his fragile skull from cracking open upon impact. He trained his body to roll instantly upon striking the floorboards, instinctively distributing the devastating kinetic energy to protect his vital internal organs. He learned to read the subtle shifts in his father's weight, anticipating the exact angle and velocity of the impending throw before Joe's muscles fully contracted. Stripped of any romanticized artistic brilliance, this hypervigilance functioned strictly as the biological hyperarousal of a prey animal locked in a cage with its predator. The continuous repetitive impact silently ground down the menisci in his knees and compressed the fragile discs in his rapidly growing spine. Cartilage was being systematically worn down to the bone, laying the groundwork for severe osteoarthritis and chronic agonizing joint pain in his later years. There was no time for recovery, no medical intervention for the microfractures forming in his wrists and ankles after hundreds of high-speed collisions. The relentless schedule meant that the tissue damage never fully healed, creating a permanent state of muscular inflammation and deep structural instability. The boy was actively weaponizing his own natural developing physical genius for a single desperate purpose: to ensure his body did not shatter into pieces. He absorbed the centrifugal force tearing at his shoulder sockets, quietly surviving the horrific biological toll of a childhood spent entirely in the air. The crowds only saw the breathtaking, seemingly weightless flight of a small boy soaring across the footlights in perfect, mesmerizing arcs. They could not hear the sickening pop of strained ligaments or feel the agonizing muscle spasms that kept the child awake in the dead of night. The physical vessel that generated the uproarious laughter was being fundamentally dismantled, sacrificed piece by piece to sustain the family's financial survival. Every flawlessly executed stunt, every bone-jarring landing, was a transaction where Buster exchanged a fragment of his long-term physical health for the immediate roar of the crowd. The body was forcibly adapting to the trauma, hardening its outer shell to withstand the endless barrage of throws, drops, and devastating collisions. Yet the physical destruction of his joints and muscles was merely the superficial layer of a much deeper, far more insidious process of psychological conditioning that was actively reshaping his mind. The physical devastation inflicted upon Buster's skeletal structure was merely the outer shell of a much deeper, far more insidious psychological mutilation. If the rough stage floor shattered his cartilage, the systematic conditioning by his father shattered his fundamental neurological responses. Buster Keaton is universally recognized today for his deadpan expression, a look celebrated as the absolute pinnacle of silent comedy acting. Yet this globally revered visage was never a calculated theatrical choice made by a brilliant aspiring artist. It was a severe trauma response, a defense mechanism violently hammered into the neural pathways of a captive toddler. Joe Keaton, observing the volatile reactions of the vaudeville crowds, quickly identified a highly specific, disturbing psychological quirk in his audience. Whenever he hurled his son across the wooden floorboards and the child instinctively cried out in pain, a sudden wave of guilt would immediately freeze the theater. The uproarious laughter would abruptly choke off, replaced by a tense, uncomfortable silence, as the reality of child abuse momentarily pierced their entertainment. Conversely, if the boy happened to smile or giggle after a brutal landing, the audience perceived it as a harmless game, destroying the dangerous illusion of the act. The commercial success of the routine strictly relied on the audience believing they were witnessing extreme violence, without having to bear the moral consequence of a suffering victim. To guarantee the continuous flow of ticket sales and roaring laughter, Joe required his son to absorb horrific physical impacts with a completely blank, impassive exterior. He initiated a rigorous, unrelenting regime of emotional castration, designed to completely sever the child's physical sensations from his facial expressions. The moment Buster hit the floor, his developing nervous system would naturally scream, sending frantic pain signals straight to his brain. But before his facial muscles could even twitch to form a grimace or release a single tear, his father would interject with a sharp, localized threat. Whenever the boy's lip quivered from the agonizing sting of friction burns, or whenever a genuine smile threatened to break through, Joe would lean in close. He would deliver a sharp, venomous whisper directly into his son's ear, consisting of a single, terrifying command: face. Far from a simple directorial cue, this sharp hiss functioned as a strict military order, demanding the immediate and absolute erasure of the boy's human nature. It was an explicit threat of further, more severe punishment off stage if the child dared to visibly register the trauma being inflicted upon his physical vessel. Buster was strictly forbidden from shedding a single tear when his ligaments were pulled to their absolute breaking point. He was equally banned from displaying any flicker of joy, effectively locking his emotional spectrum in a state of permanent, enforced paralysis. His developing brain was being systematically reprogrammed through sheer terror, forced to associate the natural expression of any emotion with immediate physical and verbal retaliation. The child quickly learned that his own humanity was a dangerous liability, a critical flaw that severely reduced his commercial value in his father's eyes. To survive the nightly onslaught, the boy's psyche had to completely detach from his physical body. When his father's heavy hands grabbed the suitcase handle and launched him into the scenery, Buster's mind dissociated, leaving his nerves and bones to take the hit alone. The blank stare was the visual evidence of a child retreating deep into the darkest corners of his own consciousness, hiding from the unbearable reality of the stage. He built an impenetrable fortress around his central nervous system, ensuring that no amount of blunt force trauma could breach the surface and provoke a human reaction. This extreme emotional suppression was so absolute and enforced with such brutal consistency that it fundamentally altered his cognitive and neurological development. By the time he reached adolescence, the suppression of distress or happiness had become deeply ingrained in his reflexes. Decades later, Keaton himself chillingly admitted that maintaining the rigid, emotionless expression under the spotlight was a purely mechanical, involuntary action. The stone face was no longer a conscious performance. It was an inescapable psychological armor forged by trauma, trapping him within his own lucrative persona the moment he stepped before an audience. He had been expertly trained out of his own natural reflexes, transformed into a highly efficient, unfeeling biological machine designed solely for public consumption. The audiences screamed with laughter at the little boy who could take a brutal beating and stand back up with eyes as cold and empty as glass. They praised his comedic timing, entirely oblivious to the terrifying reality that they were applauding the successful psychological lobotomy of a developing child. The famous expression was not a character he put on for the crowds. It was the permanent scar tissue covering a severely mutilated psyche. Every time the audience cheered for his impassive reaction to a violent fall, they were actively reinforcing the psychological chains binding him. His neural pathways became rigidly fixed, hardwiring the strict connection between physical trauma and emotional absolute zero. The natural human instinct to seek comfort or display vulnerability was systematically starved of oxygen until it withered and died within him. He was a prisoner trapped inside his own flesh, possessing a nervous system that absorbed devastating amounts of pain, but was denied the basic biological release of crying. The internal pressure of this unexpressed agony began to severely warp his perception of normal human interaction and emotional intimacy. Because he was punished for showing pain, he began to internalize the destructive belief that his suffering was entirely irrelevant, a mere byproduct of generating revenue. His father had effectively commodified his son's silence, turning the forced absence of tears into a highly lucrative spectacle for the vaudeville circuit. Moving far beyond a performer executing a physically demanding role, he functioned as a living, breathing testament to the devastating power of prolonged operant conditioning. The tragic reality of this emotional castration was that it left him entirely defenseless against the complex psychological warfare of the outside world. He knew exactly how to brace his skeletal structure for a 30-foot drop, but he possessed absolutely zero defense mechanisms against emotional manipulation or verbal abuse. The stage had taught him that blind compliance and absolute silence were the only viable strategies for survival, a lesson that would systematically destroy his adult life. His inability to articulate his own internal state meant that he carried the accumulated trauma of thousands of violent impacts in complete, agonizing isolation. He became a man profoundly alienated from his own internal landscape, moving through his professional world with the disconnected precision of a mechanical architect. The lively, expressive child he might have been was suffocated beneath the heavy weight of his father's relentless ambition. What remained was a highly specialized survivor, capable of calculating complex physical trajectories, but deeply ill-equipped to navigate the vulnerable, organic spectrum of human intimacy. The applause of the crowd served as the daily requiem for a stolen childhood, masking the silent screams of a boy who had forgotten how to weep. The systematic destruction of this child did not happen in a vacuum, completely hidden from the eyes of the law. The nightly spectacle of a boy being hurled into orchestra pits naturally attracted the aggressive scrutiny of child protection authorities. The New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, widely known and feared by vaudeville performers as the Jerry Society, relentlessly pursued the Keaton family. They suspected that Joe Keaton was not merely violating child labor laws, but actively inflicting severe, life-threatening physical abuse upon his own flesh and blood. Theater raids became a routine, terrifying disruption to the family's brutal touring schedule. Investigators would storm backstage, demanding to inspect the working conditions and the physical state of the boy they had just seen violently launched across the floorboards. Joe Keaton, however, was a master of evasion, utilizing the very laws designed to protect children to legally legitimize his exploitation. When confronted with strict regulations explicitly banning children under the age of 7 from performing, Joe presented an audaciously cruel legal defense. He stood before judges and investigators and coolly argued that his son was not actually a performer or an actor in any legal sense. Joe claimed that the boy possessed no lines, initiated no independent action, and was merely manipulated by the adults on stage. Therefore, Joe argued, the child was legally nothing more than a living stage prop, entirely devoid of agency or rights. He successfully equated the bruised, breathing body of his son to a wooden juggling club, a prop chair, or a painted backdrop. This dehumanizing legal classification stripped the boy of his fundamental human rights right in front of a court of law. The system was paralyzed by this loophole, struggling to classify a human child who was being utilized exclusively as a kinetic projectile. To further bypass the persistent legal harassment, the family engineered an incredibly grotesque and deeply damaging psychological manipulation of the boy's identity. They began to actively spread rumors throughout the vaudeville circuit that Buster was not a child at all, but a fully grown adult dwarf. To sell this bizarre optical illusion to the authorities and the public, Joe forced his toddler into custom-tailored miniature adult suits. They handed the small boy a heavy walking cane and instructed him to adopt the weary, cynical posture of a middle-aged man. They paraded him past inspectors and rival performers, actively erasing his chronological age and fundamentally denying his childhood existence. The boy was trapped in a surreal nightmare, forced to impersonate a deformed adult simply to maintain his father's right to violently abuse him. But the most tragic and devastating reason the Jerry Society ultimately failed to rescue him was rooted in the boy's own desperate survival skills. Whenever authorities managed to corner the family and demanded to physically examine the child, they would strip Buster down to his bare skin. They were searching for the undeniable bloody evidence of abuse, severe lacerations, deep contusions, and the dark purple mottling of internal bleeding. Yet, as they inspected the boy's small torso and limbs, they found an astonishing, horrifying lack of visible physical trauma. Because the child had become so incredibly adept at absorbing kinetic energy and executing life-saving roles, his physical flesh rarely showed severe bruising. The microfractures in his bones and the tearing of his deep tissue ligaments were completely invisible to the naked eye of a rushed inspector. His body had developed an unnatural hardened resilience, metabolizing the blunt force trauma so efficiently that it left no superficial marks. The boy's extraordinary ability to avoid snapping his own spine upon impact inadvertently provided his father with the perfect, unimpeachable alibi. The tragic irony of this reality is almost too heavy to bear. The child's desperate biological genius for staying alive became the exact evidence used to legally validate his continued torture. The inspectors, lacking the visible markers of a battered child, were legally forced to drop their cases and retreat from the theaters. They abandoned him to his fate, officially certifying the myth that Joe Keaton was simply executing highly skilled, harmless, theatrical illusions. This profound failure of the legal system officially birthed the devastating moniker of the indestructible child, a title that functioned as a death sentence for his youth. The public and the press eagerly swallowed this myth, entirely absolving themselves of any moral responsibility for the violence they paid to witness. They convinced themselves that the boy was somehow biologically immune to pain, a mutant freak of nature who felt nothing when he slammed into solid wood. This collective delusion allowed the vaudeville industry to continue commodifying his physical suffering without a shred of institutional guilt. The audience's roaring laughter was no longer just the sound of entertainment. It was the chilling sound of absolute, systemic complicity. Every ticket sold was a direct financial endorsement of a father's right to use his son's nervous system as a heavily battered revenue stream. The boy looked out into the darkness of the theater and saw thousands of smiling faces actively funding the destruction of his cartilage and the suppression of his soul. He learned that society would not protect him, that the law was easily manipulated, and that his physical agony was entirely acceptable as long as it generated a profit. He was entirely isolated in plain sight, performing extreme acts of physical survival under the blinding glare of the spotlight. The stage became his entire universe, a brutal enclosed ecosystem where his only value was measured by the velocity of his throws and the perfection of his silent landings. His identity was entirely consumed by the machinery of the act, his physical vessel hijacked to serve the insatiable demands of his father's contracting debts and the crowd's bloodlust. The trauma was no longer just a series of violent physical events. It had become the permanent, unyielding architecture of his entire existence. As the years ground on, the physical toll began to compound, silently rotting the foundation of his rapidly growing skeletal structure. The boy's joints were constantly inflamed, his muscles chronically strained, yet he was forced to perform 2, sometimes 3, exhausting shows a day. There was no concept of a sick day, no medical leave for a torn rotator cuff or a severe concussion sustained during a botched throw. The show was a ravenous beast that demanded a daily sacrifice of flesh and bone, and Buster was the only offering his father possessed. The horrifying truth of the vaudeville era was that a child's body was viewed as a highly expendable, rapidly depreciating asset. If one joint failed, the routine was simply altered to put extreme pressure on another, compensating for the injury rather than allowing it to heal. Buster's physical form was being systematically mined for its shock value, stripped of its structural integrity night after night until there was almost nothing left. Instead of signifying a triumph of the human spirit, his legendary endurance was strictly the agonizing result of a biological vessel granted absolutely no permission to collapse. He was a prisoner locked inside a biological cage of his own developing muscle and bone, bound by legally sanctioned contracts and systemic apathy. The very institutions designed to pull children from the grip of exploitation had looked at his unbruised skin and declared his suffering a mere theatrical illusion. This profound betrayal severed his final tether to the protective mechanisms of normal society, leaving him entirely at the mercy of a volatile, increasingly unstable father. The boy was left to navigate the escalating violence of the act alone, relying solely on his numbed reflexes. and a face wiped entirely clean of human emotion. The physical deterioration of the Keaton vaudeville act accelerated violently as Joe Keaton surrendered completely to severe chronic alcoholism. A drunken handler is a lethal threat to a child whose very survival depends on millimeter precision in midair. The timing of the throws became dangerously erratic. The father's grip slipping on the suitcase handle, the velocity and trajectory entirely miscalculated. The nightly routine devolved from calculated, profitable abuse into a genuine game of Russian roulette played out on wooden floorboards. One catastrophic misjudgment launched the boy with improper rotation, resulting in a devastating crash that left Buster unconscious on the stage for 18 hours. The mechanical precision that had kept the child alive was dissolving rapidly in a haze of cheap liquor. The environment grew increasingly lethal, compounded by the deafening roar of the vaudeville orchestras and the physical beatings that slowly began to destroy the boy's auditory nerves. This creeping deafness would isolate him even further as he aged, locking him inside a silent, damaged shell. Survival eventually dictated absolute escape. In his early 20s, the heavily battered young man finally broke the physical tether to his volatile father and fled to the emerging chaotic frontier of Hollywood. Cinema offered a temporary, glittering illusion of salvation and control. For a brief, intensely brilliant period in the 1920s, Buster Keaton captured the attention of the globe through his own independent studio. He repurposed the defensive falling techniques beaten into his muscle memory as a toddler and transformed them into unprecedented cinematic architecture. He hurled himself from collapsing buildings, stood stoically as heavy train cars derailed inches from his body, and absorbed massive physical impacts directly on camera. The public saw a comedic genius pushing the absolute boundaries of film production. They did not recognize that they were watching a profoundly traumatized adult compulsively repeating the physical abuse of his childhood, taking devastating hits because enduring physical pain was the only way his nervous system knew how to function. The ultimate manifestation of this fatalistic conditioning was permanently burned onto celluloid in 1928 during the production of Steamboat Bill Jr. As his personal life began to fracture and the looming threat of corporate studio absorption threatened his independent operation, Keaton orchestrated a sequence that bypassed theatrical danger entirely and stepped directly into the realm of a publicly filmed suicide attempt. He instructed his crew to construct an authentic 2-ton wooden house facade and meticulously calculated its downward trajectory. He stood precisely on a designated mark, physically driving a nail into the dirt to anchor his boots, and ordered the crew to release the massive structure directly over his head. His survival relied exclusively on a small open attic window passing perfectly over his shoulders, offering a lethal 2-inch margin of clearance on all sides. If his calculations were off by a fraction of a degree, or if a sudden gust of wind altered the descent, the heavy timber would have instantly crushed his skull and spine into the earth. The camera rolled, and the massive walls slammed into the ground around him, kicking up a violent storm of dust. Keaton stood absolutely frozen in the center of the debris, his face utterly blank, his body completely rigid. This was not the calculated bravery of a performer executing a trick. In that terrifying second, facing almost certain annihilation, he found a dark, familiar comfort in the cold, uncompromising laws of physics. He inherently trusted the heavy, falling wood far more than he had ever trusted any human being, surrendering his life to the geometry of the drop because the sheer, blinding adrenaline of near death was the only stimulus powerful enough to momentarily pierce the heavy numbness inside him. The exact moment Buster Keaton transitioned from a battered vaudeville prop into a cinematic architect occurred in a small New York studio in 1917, driven by a profound obsession with machinery rather than a desire for artistic expression. Upon walking onto the film set of comedic star Roscoe Arbuckle, Keaton completely ignored the actors and immediately demanded to dismantle the primary Bell and Howell camera. He spent hours stripping the heavy device down to its raw gears, meticulously studying the complex interplay of lenses, the mechanics of the shutter, and the exact mathematics of film projection. Transcending the idle curiosity of a young performer, this meticulous mechanical study sparked a profound psychological revelation for a highly traumatized mind. On the vaudeville stage, his survival had depended entirely on anticipating the volatile, unpredictable muscle spasms of an alcoholic father. Now, he was holding a predictable, emotionless machine governed strictly by the absolute laws of physics and optics. The camera did not demand compliance through physical violence. It simply recorded the precise geometric reality placed before it. He instantly recognized that if he could master the mechanical operation of this device, he could permanently transfer the control of his physical body from his father's abusive grip into his own hands. He refused to rely on standard theatrical trickery, insisting instead on manipulating the very medium of film itself. He mathematically calculated the exact frame rates required to artificially alter a fall, and he pioneered complex double exposures that allowed him to interact with multiple versions of his own battered body on a single strip of celluloid. By taking absolute control of the editing room and the camera placement, he systematically stripped away the live audience that had been complicit in his childhood abuse. There were no longer thousands of roaring spectators sitting in the dark, demanding a violent spectacle. There was only the silent, unblinking glass eye of the lens. This mechanical isolation provided him with a profound sense of psychological safety. He was no longer a human mop being forcefully dragged across splintered pine. He was the supreme director of his own physical universe, utilizing advanced mechanical engineering to dictate exactly how and when his body would impact the earth. The profound tragedy of this mechanical mastery was that it further alienated him from the organic emotional world of human beings. He learned to communicate intimately with gears, sprockets, and chemical developers, but he remained utterly incapable of navigating the unpredictable, deeply organic landscape of human relationships. This era of creative autonomy was a fragile anomaly in a life entirely defined by subjugation. The true, inescapable psychological toll of his upbringing crystallized when the landscape of Hollywood consolidated into massive corporate monopolies. Buster was maneuvered into signing a highly restrictive contract with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, surrendering his independent studio and placing his entire physical and creative output under the direct control of studio executives. The executives immediately stripped away his creative autonomy, handing him rigidly scripted inferior gags and explicitly dictating his every movement on set. They did not want an independent auteur. They wanted a highly compliant physical asset. The cinematic machinery of MGM functioned exactly like his father's vaudeville act. They required a human prop to generate massive revenue, and Buster was seamlessly slotted back into the deeply familiar role of a utilized, unthinking object. A healthy artist possessing a functioning ego and a baseline of self-worth would have rebelled violently against this blatant corporate degradation. Buster possessed neither. The deep psychological conditioning hammered into his developing brain on the vaudeville stage completely disabled his capacity for resistance. When the studio executives dismissed his ideas, forced him into humiliating roles, and systematically dismantled his artistic dignity, Buster did not fight back. He had been explicitly trained since the age of 3 that defiance resulted in severe punishment, and that his own desires or physical boundaries were entirely irrelevant. He was a perfectly compliant biological machine, programmed to absorb external abuse without uttering a single word of complaint. The traumatic command to maintain a blank face transferred effortlessly from his violent father to the Hollywood executives. He simply took the psychological beating, stood on his designated mark, and performed the physical task required of him. This absolute inability to advocate for his own humanity triggered a catastrophic internal collapse. The emotional castration that had saved his life as a targeted child now left him entirely defenseless as an exploited adult. He possessed no psychological tools to process the immense grief of losing his cinematic voice or the profound isolation that defined his personal life. Stripped of his autonomy and forced to perform mechanically under the glaring studio lights, the hollow void inside him expanded rapidly. To quiet the screaming of his damaged nervous system and to numb the paralyzing reality of his subjugation, he adopted the exact destructive coping mechanism that had consumed his father. He began to drink with a terrifying systematic efficiency. The alcohol was not a recreational indulgence or a social lubricant. It was a desperate, self-administered anesthetic. He consumed a full bottle of raw whiskey every single day, pouring hard liquor into a body already severely compromised by decades of blunt force trauma and unhealed microfractures. The whiskey bypassed his rigid, unmoving facial muscles and went straight to work on his central nervous system, artificially inducing the absolute numbness that his mind could no longer sustain on its own. He was attempting to drown the ghost of the battered toddler still trapped inside his rib cage. The heavy intoxication provided a thick chemical shield against the suffocating control of the studio system and the terrifying emptiness of his off-screen existence. Lacking the psychological tools to express vulnerability or forge deeply grounded emotional connections, his personal life fractured rapidly and painfully. He endured 2 disastrous marriages that disintegrated into bitter, highly publicized divorces. Women found themselves married to an emotionally impenetrable fortress, a man who could execute a lethal physical stunt with flawless precision, but struggled immensely to articulate his own internal trauma or offer genuine emotional reciprocation. The severe hearing loss creeping into his ears perfectly mirrored the emotional silence of his mind, cutting him off completely from the very people trying to reach him. He retreated further into the whiskey bottle, isolating himself in a dark, silent world where neither the cheers of the theater crowds nor the demands of the studio executives could reach him. He had survived the extreme physical violence of his youth, only to orchestrate his own slow, deliberate destruction in adulthood. The absolute nadir of Buster Keaton's existence did not occur on a splintered stage or a chaotic film set, but within the sterile, heavily fortified walls of a psychiatric sanitarium. The physical vessel that had miraculously survived thousands of high-velocity impacts finally surrendered to the toxic flood of alcohol. Stripped of his autonomy yet again, he was strapped tightly into a canvas straitjacket, physically restrained, while his damaged central nervous system went into severe, violent withdrawal. The irony is agonizingly sharp. The man who had built a global cinematic empire on his unparalleled ability to move freely and adapt through physical space was now completely immobilized, locked in a clinical cell, hallucinating in the dark. The straitjacket was merely the external physical manifestation of the invisible bindings his father had wrapped around his psyche 3 decades earlier. He was trapped, enduring the sheer agony of delirium tremens in total isolation, unable to vocalize his terror because the biological mechanism for crying had been permanently dismantled in his youth. His body, once falsely heralded by the press and the public as indestructible, began to present the catastrophic, delayed bill for his childhood. The cartilage in his knees and spine, ground down to the bone during the relentless vaudeville years, calcified into rigid, highly painful bone spurs. The countless microfractures he had sustained as a toddler, forcefully hurled against wooden scenery, manifested as severe crippling osteoarthritis. His hearing, heavily damaged by the blunt force trauma to his head and the roaring brass orchestras of his youth, faded rapidly into profound deafness. This auditory isolation severed his final weak threads to the outside world, locking him entirely in a silent void where he could no longer hear the laughter he was still desperately trying to generate. Every single stunt, every violent throw orchestrated by his father, and every bruising fall demanded payment in the currency of chronic, inescapable physical pain. The human machine was breaking down, its gears stripped and its structural integrity fundamentally compromised by a lifetime of extreme, unmitigated physical abuse. He eventually clawed his way out of the sanitarium, finding a fragile, quiet stability in a third marriage, but the fundamental architecture of his life remained completely altered. When the world suddenly rediscovered his silent films in the late 1950s and early 1960s, a massive wave of global adulation washed over him. He was brought to prestigious film festivals in Venice and Cannes, standing before roaring crowds of critics and filmmakers who gave him 10-minute standing ovations. They hailed him as a singular comedic genius, a pioneer of cinematic geometry, and an absolute master of the human form. Yet the frail man absorbing this thunderous applause was a deeply scarred survivor of systemic child abuse. He stood on those stages with a spine that ached constantly, ears that could barely register the cheers, and a face that still reflexively locked itself into a rigid, emotionless mask. The public was desperately attempting to crown a king, entirely ignorant of the fact that they were decorating a heavily battered casualty of the entertainment industry. We study his films in academic institutions across the globe, meticulously analyzing the framing, the immaculate timing, and the breathtaking lethal danger of his physical stunts. We marvel at the sheer bravery of a man willing to risk his life for a single, perfect frame of celluloid. But this reverence is built upon a profound, deliberate, societal blindness. We celebrate the pristine art while aggressively ignoring the bloody, traumatic foundation upon which it was constructed. The unparalleled physical grace we admire was forged entirely in the fires of sheer childhood terror. The stoic, unyielding face that became his global trademark was not a brilliant, calculated acting choice, but the permanent, hardened scar tissue of a severely mutilated psyche. His legacy is an enduring testament to the fragile beauty of human endurance, but it also serves as a stark, horrifying indictment of an industry that consumed a child for its own financial amusement. We forcefully condemn the historical barbarism of parents exploiting their children, dismissing the vaudeville era as a dark, unregulated nightmare. We look back in absolute horror at a society that allowed a father to sew a suitcase handle onto a toddler's coat to hurl him at paying crowds. Yet we eagerly consume, preserve, and immortalize the exact products of that very exploitation, granting the victim state-like reverence and the highest cinematic glory. We elevate Buster Keaton to the status of a comedic deity, placing him on a towering cultural pedestal built entirely from his own shattered cartilage, repressed trauma, and forcibly suppressed tears. The entire world collectively agreed to look past the heavily bruised boy being dragged across the floorboards, to universally worship the silent, unbreakable clown he was forced to become. When the projector finally stops running and the deafening laughter of the audience fades entirely into the dark, we must confront the true terrifying cost of this immortal brilliance. If the undisputed pinnacle of physical comedy was purchased with the systematic destruction of a little boy's body and the permanent eradication of his emotional soul, then are we applauding a miracle of human art, or are we simply standing over a gilded crime scene cheering for the corpse?